Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of Draft Talk on Pittsburgh Sports Live. I'm Alan Saunders. That's Nick Farabaugh. We're back from the NFL Combine in Indianapolis, where we spent all last week talking to prospects, watching drills, talking to people around the league, eating and drinking a whole lot. Yeah, I mean, that's the highlights. I feel like we learned a lot about what's happening in the 2023 NFL Draft, and now we're going to bring it to you. We already kind of went over last week the defensive side of the football. We talked a lot about the defensive linemen, the linebackers, and the cornerbacks and how they relate to the Steelers. Today, I want to kind of hit the offensive side. We touched on the wide receivers a little bit. We'll get to them a little bit more. But the big subject I really want to talk about is the offensive line, the players that we talked to, how they fit with the Steelers. And to me, I don't know, there's a big hole here for the Steelers. But let's just get into it. Nick, what was your big takeaways from the offensive line at the Combine?
They're not that interested in making a ton of upgrades. I legitimately, that's my takeaway. I just think that their upgrades are going to be early or it's a swing tackle. I think that they met with, like, it hit me with a lot of that middle group. Like Harrison was only an informal. I think Wright was a formal, and Jones, we didn't find out, but I would assume Jawan Jones is probably a formal. Like the top five guys, top six guys are kind of a mix. And to me, that signals that they're not that interested in drafting a guy in the third round and trying to groom him to replace Dan Moore. Like that guy, if they draft him, is the swing tackle. And maybe that's where they're going to address more this year. Maybe they're looking at the depth of their O-line and they're trying to build that out, which they do need. There's no doubt about that.
Inside, where you don't necessarily need to take a high pick to make an upgrade.
Yeah,
but if
right.
we're talking about tackle, I agree. And let's talk about those tiers, because I think that's kind of the thing that I feel like I learned, is that I feel like there are very distinct tiers in this tackle class. And while there's not a big, to me, there's not a clear cut order of the guys that are within those tiers. I think that the tiers themselves have really become very clear to me. And that in tier one, you have Peter Skoronski from Northwestern, Paris Johnson from Ohio State, and Broderick Jones from Georgia. That's it. That's the list. Those are the three guys. I heard some different opinions about who people think is the best one at the Combine this week. But I'll tell you this, they're all the best three. And I also think they're all unlikely to be there when the Steelers drafted 17.
Yeah, I think I think the likeliest of them is actually Skoronski, which is the interesting thing. Because I just think that there's going to be a lot of teams that view him as a guard. And, you know, he came in with 32 and 1/4 inch arms. So it's possible. We had the scare with Harrison too, where apparently he had sub 32 inch, but then they recorrected that to 34. I think another thing I thought was interesting was that Skoronski said that teams have been viewing him at center. That was interesting. I never thought of that one. But he did play center in high school.
He's 6'4", and there aren't very many 6'4". That doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Well,
I don't know where that came from.
He also played center in high school, and he's a wrestler, and that background usually goes pretty well to center. So I get it. But it's just not a common switch. It's not a common switch to go all the way from tackle to center. It's just a really hard switch to go from the outside all the way to the inside and command the whole thing. So that's interesting. I think the other thing that was interesting is I think there's a very defined three in the second tier. At least to me, there's a defined three.
I totally agree. We have a defined top three and then a defined second three.
Yeah, and those three are Darnell Wright, DeJuan Jones, and Anton Harrison. I think that would be those three.
And of this group, I think none are likely to be taken before 20, say. Like, I just feel like the Steelers are in between those two groups, where I don't think any of the first group are going to be available, but I don't think anybody else would even be considering any of the second group.
Exactly. And so 32 is the sweet spot for that second group. Does one of them make it there? Darnell Wright had a really good combine, I thought. I think he's the number one of that second group at this point. I think Jones, he's a big dude, man. He's not going to fit everyone's flavor, but I think he's going to fit Steelers' flavor.
And I think Jones is a very high upside, but also bust potential, whereas Wright is sort of the total opposite. Played a ton of college football at a high level. He kind of is what he is, but what he is pretty good, even if it isn't necessarily all pro great.
Yeah, and then there's Anton Harrison, who's the most interesting of all three of them, in my opinion, because you don't really have a distinct archetype for him, because he is a fascinating player who has a lot of raw edges to his game, but he is a very, very high upside player who comes from a really good O-line school under Bill Bedebaugh. He is a really fun type of player to mock. I think there's a chance that he could make it potentially to 49, which is something that is an outside chance, but I would not be surprised to see the Steelers maybe take a shot on him at 32. He's a very interesting player because
I think any of this second group is definitely on the table for the Steelers with that first pick in the second round.
I absolutely
100%.
agree. But besides that, we have guys like Matthew Bergeron, Jalen Duncan.
To me, this is the third tier, right? Bergeron, Duncan, maybe Blake Freeland. Cody Mock is a guy you're going to see put in there by a lot of like
guard
ranking, but he's a guard, man. He and Tyler Steen from Alabama is a guy
I like him.
Had a pretty good week and probably moved himself up into that third group. And these are guys that I think are probably talking about options for that third round pick, number whatever it is, 79 or 80.
Yeah, and these guys are not going to start. If you drafted Jalen Duncan, like he has a lot of good traits, but here's how I would compare Duncan, Bergeron, Freeland, all of those guys. Chooks Okorafor coming out of Western Michigan. That's what they are.
Maybe not quite that raw, but not well-rounded, right? Where
They got a lot to work on. Like Pat Meyer and Isaac Williams will have their hands full to mold them, and you will have, and they will not push Chooks Okorafor or Dan Moore for the starting job if they are picked.
Not right away, anyway. Like maybe they could be in a position where, like, hey, if one of those guys struggles throughout the year, they'd eventually take over. But you are not talking about day one starters there.
Correct. And then, if you look at the top six, I think all six of those guys will have a chance to win that job. If it's the top three, I think those top three, I would dare say, if they select either Jones, Johnson, or Skoronski, those top three would be the outright favorite to be the starting left tackle or left guard, whichever one they view Skoronski at. I think that's kind of the question for them, too, is what do they think Skoronski is? I'm always of the opinion that when you have a guy as talented as Skoronski, that you try him at tackle first, and then if it's not working out,
a guy whose strength is pass pro. Like, I think it's if he was DeJuan Jones and people were wondering if he was a tackle or a guard, I'm like, well, geez, it's just a giant guy, whatever. Move him inside if you have to. But Skoronski's so good at pass protection that it doesn't make any sense to me to move him inside. Maybe he's not the world's best tackle, but I think he's a tackle. I think it would be a waste to take him and not make him a tackle.
It would be a waste if you did not try him at tackle. Yeah. And so
but the Steelers are also in the position where he doesn't turn out to be a tackle. They can deal with that too. We've talked about that on this show.
They should not care about Peter Skoronski's guard tackle thing. I mean, they can view him as whatever, but they should be like,
unless they just don't think he can be a tackle, which I mean, I personally don't agree with, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, no, I think you got to try him there first. But
to me, Skoronski is the guy I would want the most. To me,
absolutely, I think he's the
best of the group.
Yep, I think he's the best pure offensive lineman in this class. I think he's just awesome. He's just got everything you want. He's strong. He's got core strength. He's got great leverage. His hands are good. He's
especially
a really smart
if you're
player.
Looking at a blind side tackle, like assuming your quarterback's right-handed left tackle, that's the guy that projects to be that guy for me. I totally agree.
And then second I would probably have Paris Johnson. He's built a tackle. I mean, you put the man, you prototypically built a tackle, it would come out as Paris Johnson. He's
an incredible big athlete.
And he's really, really athletic, and he's really polished for where he is. He's going to be really good. There's no way he's going to be at 17. He shouldn't be. If he is, they should run that so fast to the podium. I mean,
I honestly think if one of those guys falls, like, let me look at the first round order here. And we'll get into more as we get closer to the draft, like what teams' exact needs are and how we think the first round is going to fall and things like that. But I mean, to 13 or 14, like the Steelers need to be thinking about trading up at that point if one of those guys is still there, I think.
Yeah. Broderick Jones is probably the third to me of that group. He's a little raw. You got to work with him a little bit in pass pro, but he's a mauler in the run game. And
I loved his interview, man. He was awesome. He was really fun.
He's a fun dude.
Yeah, a really personable guy. I mean, not that like that really matters, but I think you could see. I think one of the things is, okay, if a player is great, I don't think his personality matters that much. But if you're talking about drafting a guy and like, okay, we need to be able to work with him on ABC, then I think that kind of thing is like, oh, how's he going to learn? How's he going to communicate? How's he going to deal with coaching? I think that stuff starts to matter a little bit more. And I thought he really impressed in those areas.
Yeah, and DeJuan Jones was similar to me at the
Yeah, I
Senior
agree.
Bowl,
Totally.
where
Yeah.
he's just a dog. Like this is a good tackle class, and even if we're talking about depth too, I think you got some of that. You know, you have a guy like McClendon Curtis out of Chattanooga who could be a nice swing tackle. You just have good options if you
I
want.
do think I don't think there was a guy in the what I would consider like in that day 3 pile that really stood out to me in a big way, whether it was running or the bench or interviews. You know, sometimes you can see guys from that group kind of come out of nowhere here. I didn't really see that in this group.
No, and that's the interesting thing is truly this does
Maybe
feel like a
I guess
top heavy
Steen
class.
would be the one guy that maybe moved himself into that kind of day 3, round 3 group.
Yes. But he
But
was already on that projection. I mean, he had a great Senior Bowl on top of this, and he played 5 positions in Mobile. I mean, he played left tackle, left guard, center, right guard, and right tackle. He's going to be a
I
fun
think
player.
he
I don't
was
know
in
where
the
he
backfield
lands.
for a play too, if I remember right.
Yeah, I don't know where Tyler Steen lands because I mean he's probably is he a guard? Is he? I don't know. He has experience at all 5 spots. There's really no one else in this class that could say that. So I mean
Yeah,
that's
Cody
pretty
Mock,
unique.
I guess, would be the closest thing. He played a little bit of center at the Senior Bowl as well. And he's another guy too. Like, I don't think he's a tackle, but that doesn't necessarily mean the Steelers should cross him off their list. What about the non-tackles? What about guys like John Michael Schmitz, Osiris Torrance? Where do they fit in this sort of scale that we've established here?
I came out of Indianapolis thinking that there might be a better chance they actually address interior line. I really did, and why? Just look at their
Especially if
meeting. Like, just look at their formal meetings tracker. So their formal meetings were all with just the top 3 tackles. That's it. They informally met with Jones and Harrison, as long as we know of.
and
We
they
don't
met
know
with
what's
Jones and Wright at the Senior Bowl.
yes.
So
So it's not a formal meeting for those guys. It's informal. So that's striking to me. To me, it's fairly interesting that they formally met with just about every top interior lineman. I mean, they met with Osiris Torrance again. They met with John Michael Schmitz. They met with Weipler from Ohio State. They met
Jackson
with all
Kirkland
the
from Washington.
yep. I mean, they met with all of these guys, right? Broker from Ole Miss. They met with all these interior O linemen. This to me signals a want to potentially, if the value is right, maybe select an interior lineman. And this is where Mason Cole's versatility comes into play. And so you know, some of their kind of options here, like Weipler is a center. So if they select Weipler, it's Cole that's moving to guard. But if they select John Michael Schmitz, well, who moves to guard? I don't know, because both of them can play. This to me is where Mason Cole's versatility that we talked about
Steve
last year when he
Avila is
signed.
another guy that they talked to, and he is he could play either. I think he's probably more of a guard. He's a bigger guy, 330,
Yeah,
compared to like Schmitz and Weipler, who are
yeah.
300.
Andrew Voorhees was another one. I know he tore his ACL. Unfortunately, he's a good player though. Joe Tippmann, yeah. You know, there's just a lot of interior guys here that they met with, and to me, it signals something to us. I think if like John Michael Schmitz at 32 is a very underrated possibility no one's talking about, but it makes a lot of sense. If they draft John Michael Schmitz, I don't know what they would do. Like, would they play him at guard or would they play Mason Cole at guard? I think it's an interesting proposition, but I think that's where their versatility comes in. Their whole interior O line at that point would be Schmitz, Daniels, and Cole, and they can all play all 3 spots. And so that could actually be fairly interesting if you're Pat Meyer to be able to kind of mix and match the guys you want and really not have much of a drop off. I thought though, when you looked at Mason Cole's guard tape in Minnesota compared to his center tape this year, he was much better at center this year than he was at guard in Minnesota. So I wonder if they draft John Michael Schmitz if he starts at guard.
Yeah, absolutely could. I don't think he'd be as good of a guard as a center. You know, the other thing they could do is too, like, look, Cole. I don't think anyone thinks Mason Cole's a long-term, solution for the Steelers. So he's under contract for 2 more years, 23 and 24. Like, it'd be very easy to bring Schmitz in as a guard. Have him start there. Maybe not even like maybe not
Like,
even start at the beginning of the season. I think he would probably be more likely than not to start, but it would not be like some
I
sort of
mean,
slam dunk thing. But
well, what you could do too is you could bring John Michael Schmitz and make him the center, and then have the guard battle at left guard, and give Kevin Dotson another chance at it.
right.
Like we know Dotson has had some really good moments. Well, what if he finally puts it together? I mean, you have to
Right.
give Kevin
That's the thing
Dotson
about
that.
Dotson is like his average isn't that good, but just looking at the average kind of ignores that. Like he's like a C student that like got like 8 A's and 2 F's, right?
Yeah,
Right. And so like if he could just clean up some of those bad reps, he starts to look a lot better.
he does. And so to me, I fail to see many scenarios in this O-line draft class where they don't give Kevin Dotson at least an opportunity to show
Yeah,
something.
I
And,
agree. Unless it's like Torrance to me, because that like
yeah,
he has to play there. Like that's kind of the
exactly.
only guy that like, okay, sorry, Dot, you're done. Like that's
Yeah, I mean, that's why I have a hard time seeing them draft Osiris Torrance too. I think they're gonna like listen if they draft a tackle. Well, is the then maybe Dan Moore gets a crack inside.
yeah, that's true too. Yep.
Like that's possible, right?
So
Like they draft.
okay, to me, Schmitz and Torrance you can almost put with that second group of tackles and make like a 5-man like bunch of offensive linemen that are going either at the tail end of the first round or at the beginning of the second round. You on board with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that completely.
And then maybe like the rest of these guys, like Avila and blanking on the guy from Washington's name.
Oh, Kirkland.
Kirkland, right? Yeah. Like, are they to you like sort of with that like Duncan Bergeron group?
Yeah, I would say they're with that group. I would say one guy that shot up my board out of anyone in this entire group was Whippler from Ohio State. I thought he was really good. And then you went back and watched the tape because this is a really young guy. You go back and watch the tape and you would not know that he was a legitimate redshirt sophomore. The kid is 21 years old and just turned 21. He's a really young player and he's smart. He's athletic. He can do just about everything you want from a center.
Another former wrestler.
Yeah, he's a fascinating piece to me because I think he is the one guy of this entire group that's going to be there at 49, but won't be there at 80 and could be the pick at 49.
Yeah, he's kind of a guy that is sort of, to me, in between those bunches. He's clearly not as good as Schmitz or Torrance. I think he may have elevated himself above the rest of the pack as far as the interior line.
I think he did. And listen, man, if they draft him at 49, I mean, that is a good draft pick. He's a good player and he's a smart player and he's young too. And that's the thing. And he's not like a Kendrick Green type, right? Like he's very well built. He's a guy that has a lot of experience playing at center. So you're kind of getting exactly what you thought you were going to get in Kendrick Green, except you're actually going to get that this time. And so Whippler is a good player. And at 49, that is an interesting sweet spot where they have a lot of options. If he's ready, they can play him. If he's not ready, he can become the backup interior swingman and then step in next year. I mean, it gives you the chance for Dotson again to prove himself, or you can put Whippler in there at center and Cole at guard. I mean, you can do a lot of different things at that point, but it really ups your athleticism in the interior. And I like that fact. Your entire right side at this point is very athletic. James Daniels can move. Chooks can move. You know that. Mason Cole is a decent athlete, but not a great athlete. Whippler's a great athlete. You want to run wide zone to the right side with Whippler, Daniels, and Chooks out in front. I mean, Jalen Warren and Najee Harris will just have to zoom right through because those guys are getting to those backside linebackers.
Yeah, I thought the depth at center actually showed up pretty well too. Guys like Oluwatimi, Jarrett Patterson, Juice Scruggs from Penn State. I think there's a Steelers pick there in the inside, whether or not it's on the first 2 days.
I'll tell you a fun day 3 offensive tackle who didn't work out, but I like his tape. Carter Warren. I mean, it does make a lot of sense for Carter Warren to be like an interesting day 3 swing tackle guy. I think he does have a lot of good traits to be that.
Yeah, found out it was just a meniscus for his knee too, so I think that's probably a positive for him as well. All right, let's change gears here and talk about the wide receivers. We did talk about them a little bit in our last episode, which you can find here on the Pittsburgh Sports Live YouTube channel, but we didn't have the 40 times yet for those wide receivers. Now we do. Any big news from you out of that group? To me, I think there's some up and some down.
Yeah. First of all, Addison's day is one of the weirdest days I've seen. So he gets hurt in the middle of it, withdraws with a back injury, doesn't really test super well, runs a 4.49. His
Just like
explosive.
okay, but then he was only 173 pounds or something like that, like one of the lightest receivers there.
It is here's just what I'm gonna say. He is in dangerous territory in terms of where you actually look at what he brings to the table. I mean, here are some of the guys he will compare to in terms of that weight and that size. D.D. Westbrook is someone that he'll compare to. Deontay Burnett out of USC, if you remember him, he had a lot of hype in that class, ended up flaming out quickly. Josh Johnson last year out of Tulsa. Now we start getting into some interesting players. Jalen Waddle, but he's not as fast as Jalen Waddle. Marquez Stevenson, who's in the league as a return man. Javon Durant. Marquise Hollywood Brown. John Mechie. Like, it's not a prolific list that he's a part of here. And all those guys that you're like, oh, they're good. Well, they ran 4.3. Like, that Hollywood Brown ran the boots off his feet at the combine. So did Jalen Waddle. Addison didn't. He's a weird type of player to fully get on board with because of kind of the interesting athletic profile he has. But I think you and I both know this from watching Jordan Addison. He never really won with his explosiveness or his speed. It always felt like he won it with his agility. And that's one thing.
The direction.
So he hurt his back before he could do the agilities. And I
Right.
want to see Jordan Addison do the agilities at USC's Pro Day because I think he's actually going to really do well in that
I
area.
think he could also improve on that 40 time a good bit too. Like his
Yeah.
running form did not look that great.
No. And maybe that was the back. I don't know. But
yeah, it could have been.
But I mean, it's interesting. I see people saying, well, he's going to be there at 32 now. Guys, trust me, Jordan Addison's not going to be there at 32.
The other thing is, like, I think a 40 time for a slot receiver is a little bit overrated. Like, not too many teams are having their slot receivers run 40.
Yeah.
Like, that's not what they do. It's all intermediate routes. And so, I think his size, 5'11's fine, but like 173, you're pretty much limiting yourself to a slot receiver at that weight because you're not going to be able to win releases against press coverage otherwise. So like Jordan Addison, to me, he sort of pigeonholed himself as a slot receiver, but I don't think that number, which is not that good, will kill him in the evaluation of looking at him as a slot receiver, especially if he goes to his pro day and looks good doing the agility drills.
Yeah, I think that's what he needs to do. Speaking of someone that did do the agility drills and is also looked at as a slot receiver, how about Jackson Smith and Jigba? I mean, 3.93 on the shuttle is nuts. That's an absurd number. Sub 4 is rare. And you want to talk about a guy that just fits everything in terms of the profile it said on tape. I could not give less of a crap about this guy's 40 time. He is a smooth receiver that wins with quick area explosiveness.
6'1", 196.
Yeah.
Like, big frame. Maybe not the most explosive guy, like vertically. Maybe that would be the one thing you could kind of ding him for. But man, like if you're talking about like a slot receiver, like a little bit of a thicker guy, maybe someone that could play outside if you need him to, I think he really did a lot of good for his stock.
He did a lot of good. Some of the comps on his athletic list are fun. Greg Jennings is on that list.
It's actually, to me, a very good fit.
Cooper Kupp is on that list. I mean, you have some really good Julian Edelman, like some really good guys that are just what Jackson Smith-Njigba is. He's a really good player, man.
I think talked to a lot of Ohio State people at the combine this week because the Steelers love them and they have a ton of they're always interested in those guys. And man, I didn't hear anybody say a single negative thing about this guy. Now I heard from some fans during the season last year, there was like some talk about his hamstring injury and the fact that it took him forever to come back. And there was some like I guess around the college football playoff, there was some chatter about like, is he not playing because he just doesn't want to, or things like that. I got none of that from anyone. That it seems like the consensus was he was really hurt, and that's why he couldn't play, and that's not going to be a thing going forward in terms of NFL teams evaluating him.
No, and it shouldn't be. If this guy makes it to 32, he's the easy pick. I mean, they don't really need a receiver that bad, but a guy like Jackson Smith and Jigba is like exactly what they need, and he would make a lot of sense at 32. I mean, Kenny Pickett would love a guy like this that could just win through quick area explosiveness. If there's a guy that can become a star out of this class, I think I'd put my stake on Jackson Smith and Jigba. I really would. And then you kind of have the rest of this group. Quentin Johnson tested like a freak as we expected. Jalen Hyatt, 4.41. Not a bad time for him either. And then you had Zay Flowers.
Jalen Hyatt just confirmed that he is what we thought he was, right? I mean, he's really fast, and he's a deep threat guy. Like that's what he's gonna be. His change of direction. He didn't do the the shuttle stuff, but but he is what he is.
Yeah, but Zay Flowers, I mean, coming in and running a 4.42 is really good for him. His athletic comps are pretty fun too. The big one that always shows up, and it is his number one athletic comp, is Tyler Lockett. I think that makes a lot of sense. I would take Tyler Lockett at the first round. And I really like that comp for him. But it's not I think the other thing to take away from this is it's just not a real good class.
No, and Zay Flowers, again, like 5'9", 180, probably looking at like just exclusively a slot receiver. Like if you're a team that is looking for an outside receiver in this draft, it's Quentin Johnson, maybe Jalen Hyatt, and then I don't know. Like that's the list, right? Like there's not a lot there.
I mean, there are some guys. Bryce Ford Wheaton had a real good.
Oh man, was he good?
Yeah, I mean, let me just read you off some of these numbers Bryce Ford Wheaton put up. He was 6'3.5" at 221, and he ran a 4.38, jumped a 41-inch vert. He had a 129-inch broad, which is over 11. He has 6.97 3-cone. But how about this for the 20 shuttle? 4.15. That big? Come on, man. He tested out of the water today. I mean, listen, we have a WVSN site. We've seen Bryce Ford Wheaton, both of us, play. The guy had moments on the field where I thought he could be something, man.
I just thought that often, and you look at the film and like, there's very little to pick apart with his game. It's mostly just like, what is happening with this offense?
Yeah, it really is, right? Like we talked about this a little bit. Like there's a lot of Claypool in Bryce Ford Wheaton.
I see that.
And in this class, that's a lot. I mean, look, here's some of the comps athletically that Bryce Ford Wheaton put himself in. I'm just going to read some of these. Martavis Bryant.
That's maybe even a better comp than Chase Claypool.
Yeah. Miles Austin, who was really good in Dallas for a few years. Alec Pierce last year out of Cincinnati, real good player. How about this? Andre Johnson. That Andre Johnson that played for the Texans. And then you kind of have some other guys. Allen Robinson, another good player. Chase Claypool's on that list. You have Dante Moncrief, who obviously wasn't that good, but there's a lot of good names to be with on that list for Bryce Ford Wheaton. I think if there's a receiver that did enough for his stock this week, I'm not sure anyone did more for their stock than Bryce Ford Wheaton did.
Yeah, I agree. I think he had a really good week. And I think the receiving depth in this class is good. But I think the top is thin. And so if the Steelers are going to take one that's going to be an impact guy, like, I don't know. To me, I think there's a real case to be made for one of those day 1 or 2 picks to be a wide receiver if they can fill some of these holes in free agency and they don't go in there absolutely needing like, a linebacker and a D tackle and a corner and we've got to do some of that in free agency. If they do that, I think wide receiver becomes a realistic option.
It does. And it just depends on who's there, how the board falls, all of that. But it's not a great receiver class. It's probably one of the worst ones in the recent decade, to be quite honest with you. So it's got to be, to me, a top guy, or you just take one late and you kind of put in puzzle pieces for the competition at slot. But they don't really need bodies there. Like other positions, they have Anthony Miller. They're going to probably get back Steven Sims. They have Calvin Austin. They have guys. They have Cody White. They have Miles Boykin. I assume he'll come back too. They have enough guys at wide receiver. It's not like they need to draft a receiver this year. Now,
No.
granted, it seems like they are obsessed with drafting receivers, which
Well,
I
I
can't
just think
blame
they
them
don't
for.
have any like they're it's not that they don't have bodies, it's just that they don't have talent beyond the top two guys.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying. I think they could take one late, but if they don't take one in the first 2 rounds,
I don't think they need one.
yeah, like there's no real
Or maybe
reason
you
for.
take a swing on a high upside guy like Ford Wheaton, right? Where like if
Yeah,
he just totally flames out, then it doesn't matter.
or maybe you take a shot on like Parker Washington, which would be not a bad pick. I like Parker Washington a lot,
Yeah.
but there's just not a lot of dudes in this class that I would pound the table for, which is rare because usually there is a few guys in wide receiver that you feel like you would pound the table for. So I mean, it's fine for them, but if they get the right value at 32, I think that they should definitely consider it. If a Jackson Smith-Njigba, if a Zay Flowers is there, hard to see them not actually considering that guy.
Yeah, I think so too. I think so too.
Yeah, I think it's smart for them. I mean, it's not like it's not a need. They need one. It's
Yeah.
just it's not as big of a need as the other holes that they're going to have this offseason.
We're gonna keep focusing on the draft, focusing on all that, but of course we've got free agency coming up next week too. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that on Thursday when we get back together and maybe give a little preview of how we think that is going to impact the Steelers draft talk. We'll keep it here on Pittsburgh Sports Live, SteelersNow.com for all your Steelers draft coverage. For Nick, I'm Alan. I think that's all we got today.
Yep, I think that's all.
All right, we'll see you next time.